Welcome to episode 26 of the Eyes on Privacy podcast. This week I'm joined by Josh Gillum and Keith Watson, and I'm Preston Wiley. And Keith Watson will introduce our topic of discussion for this podcast.
So, Kaspersky, our favorite Moscow-based antivirus company, did some discussion in Cancun, Mexico as part of their, annual conference that they do. And one of the reports that they issued at that time was about a group called the Equation Group, which is what they've called them. And the Equation Group has been very busy, and they have developed a number of different malware platforms and have used those to infiltrate quite an interesting set of organizations around the world. And some of the malware platforms that we're talking about are used to infect systems to determine if they're interesting or not, and if they are, use that as a mechanism to use another malware platform to provide even greater access to the system and more persistent access. We're also talking about a malware platform that was designed to map out air-gapped networks, which is very interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about that a little later. I think what's interesting about this group is the level of sophistication used in these malware platforms. You may have heard some discussion about a group having the ability to overwrite the firmware on hard drives. Well, that's the Equation Group that's done this. And it's very interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about how they were able to do that a little later. But I think probably the most interesting thing about this mysterious group is that given some of the exploits that they use, some of them zero-day exploits, and the level of sophistication in their malware platforms, the number of CNC servers and IP addresses involved in their command and control network, this is a very, very sophisticated group with lots of capabilities, and their level of technical knowledge is very, very sophisticated. So while Kaspersky doesn't specifically name them, it is widely believed that this is actually an NSA group. And part of that is linked to a description of the hard drive firmware capability in a release from Snowden, which talked specifically about that capability. And so if you put two and two together, it seems likely that this group, which has created a variety of malware platforms, is actually the source of this hard drive firmware overriding malware. So if you put two and two together, it seems very likely that this group is actually some group inside the NSA. So there's lots of detail we can talk about. I'd like to focus a little bit on some of the specific malware platforms later. I've kind of introduced them now, but I think I'll stop here with the intro and we can talk some more specifics.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Edward Snowden, but one thing to point out is this had nothing to do with Edward Snowden, this discovery, essentially. There's just a little bit of information within some of the releases of Edward Snowden that can somewhat be tied in to the information that Kaspersky obtained from the malware stuff. Mainly the Grok keylogger, I think, was the same name that was used within an Edward Snowden document that was released, and that's the one tie-in that they had. I mean, the other interesting component was this. I mean, you talked about the sophistication, and I think there's some things that the Equation Group they've seen them able to do that no other group has ever done before.
Right.
Like installing things on the hard disk firmware to allow the malware to essentially remain persistent on a computer even after a just a massive disk wipe, or using Department of Defense standard disk wipe or whatever. I mean that the malware can remain on that computer even after that sort of incident. So the sophistication of this group is on the, I think, on the scale that we've never seen before.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and I think that just talking about some of the individual malware platforms here, we can kind of see kind of that sophistication level. So first, the one thing I want to mention is the Equation Group is the name that Kaspersky gave to whatever the name of this organization is. They're calling it the Equation Group because a lot of the malware platforms have a high number of encryption algorithms used in it. That's why they call it the Equation Group, focused on a lot of the math associated with the crypto techniques. Anyways, so they've also named some of the malware platforms they've discovered. So there's one called Double Fantasy, and it's really used as this kind of initial infection mechanism. So it determines if the computer is interesting, and so there might be a variety of ways that might make it interesting. It might be the IP address, the name of the user, the location of the user, if they're in a specific country or work for a specific organization. And if that can be determined, if this target is interesting or not, then it will load another more sophisticated level of malware platform, which would be able to kind of latch on and stay in the system more significantly. And so one of those is called Equation Drug, which is a very complex platform for espionage. So once you're in and you determine that it's interesting, then this malware would decide, hey, I need to go load this other thing. And basically it would reach out to one of the command and control servers and download a new package. And then that would replace the initial infection software. And then it would have maybe multiple modules that allow for different levels of monitoring, such as maybe keystroke logger. It might be turning on your camera. It might be searching your hard drive for a variety of things. But in the Equation Drug system, they've been able to identify 35 additional modules for this one. Now, Equation Drug is one of the more older platforms, developed somewhere around 2003 up to 2013. So it doesn't work on a lot of the modern OSs because it doesn't incorporate digital signing, so it doesn't work that way. But it does encrypt the data that it's going to exfiltrate in fake Windows font files. So they're kind of hard to identify. So it kind of just caches those up in that directory of Windows font files and then uploads them to the CNC servers as it needs to. And so the next thing that comes along is a platform called Grayfish, and Grayfish is really more modern operating system ready. And this one has a lot of the same sorts of modularity to it, but it also hijacks how the operating system is loaded. So normally when Windows starts up, there's a Windows process that kind of fires up each portion of the operating system in the boot cycle. And effectively, Grayfish takes that over. Grayfish is the one controlling the booting of Windows effectively. So that was interesting as well. But what it does, it's even more sophisticated, is when it finds the information that's going to exfiltrate, it basically creates a virtual file system, and it uses the registry as the location where it stores that. So that right there should tell you what you need to know in terms of level of sophistication here. And so really, it also encrypts a lot of its own modules, so that in that manner it's able to hide from a lot of antivirus software as well. So that's 3 different platforms right there. One, to determine if the system is interesting, and if it is, then to load another malware platform for this longer-term espionage type work. But it gets even better. And before we talk about the last one, I wanted to pause for a second and see if anybody else has any comments on any of those first 3.
Well, I had a comment on the interesting part, and I think it's interesting what was found interesting. So, I mean, these aren't this isn't malware to infect as many people as possible. This is specific malware targeted to specific countries, specific industries within specific countries, and within a lot of the malware, I mean, there was stuff discovered like don't only infect from if the origin is these countries. So the definition of interesting, I think, is interesting. In what just because this isn't like like suck as much data in as possible type thing. This is we want to target specific countries, specific targets, and it's not. I mean, and I think the idea behind that is if you target exactly what you're looking for, hopefully it'll be a while before somebody discovers what you're up to, and in this case, it took at least 14 years.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
For this to be discovered, this group.
And if you're able to, not take that wide and deep approach, and be more targeted and selective, then certainly it doesn't make it harder for you to be detected. And the other interesting thing is a lot of these malware platforms had self-destruct mechanisms, if you will. And so if they didn't find anything to be interesting or whatever, they could, or if they received a command from their CNC server, that they would actually self-destruct and in a sense clean up so no one knew they were there too. So that's also a handy feature when you're writing your malware. Okay, well, the other thing, unless Josh had something to contribute there real quick.
I was just going to jump into the Fanny part, which was
great.
the last one. I thought that was interesting. So I guess I didn't get it, or I have some questions about it. I guess I'll explain the basics of it first. It was using jump drives that are onto the internet or connected to the internet, and then if they needed to get data from the internet to their jumped network or their gap network, they would put it on a USB drive, move it over there, and then do their get whatever data they need to put on there. Well, so to me it doesn't say exactly how, but they're getting malware onto the USB stick that is invisible, so you don't know what's actually on there. And then when it goes over to the gap network, it is capturing data from that gap network, and then once that jump drive gets brought back over to the internet version or network, it can then communicate back to the CNC of what it had, and it sounded like the CNC could then give it instructions for the next time it went over there to try to map, figure out more about that environment. So it was more of a long-term way to communicate with the air-gapped network.
Yeah, definitely long-term I think is a key word there, because you're kind of relying on a human to continually plug in their USB stick both on their internet-connected machine and then to take it over to this air-gapped network as well, and that can take some time. And plus you're kind of relying on the USB key to also infect whatever machine it's plugged into using an exploit, and then to load malware on that system so it could facilitate the communication or the probing or load whatever modules from the USB stick in order to gather data. So that alone is pretty sophisticated right there.
And you could do the same thing with the CD-ROM drive. I know it doesn't say this specifically, but if you had to burn a CD over every time, and the machine that you were burning the CDs on, if that was infected, I'm sure there's got to be something similar to be able to hide on a CD too.
Well, you could, but you probably wouldn't be able to easily put data back on the CD. And I think the USB stick is a good example of having plenty of storage, so that when you did find something, you stored it on the USB stick, and then when they plugged it into that internet computer, then you sent it out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that works better in that case. And it is possible to, like on a Windows machine with auto run, right? It's always running whenever you stick something into a drive, and Windows wants to run it for you, even when you least expect it. But in this case, I think this was using exploitable problems in USB or in the driver system, so that when you did plug that stick in, it actually infected the machine. So I don't think it necessarily had to take advantage of weaknesses in auto run, but I'm certain that probably that could be a possibility if somebody had, we have some of these sticks that have software on them that want to run when you plug them into a Windows machine that make your use of the USB stick easier, whatever that means. Certainly possible that could be malicious, and that could be one way that this could have done that. But I think this specifically used flaws in USB and in the way the driver system worked to infect systems.
Yeah, it used the then unknown vulnerability in the way Windows displays LNK files when a USB stick is connected to a PC.
Right.
So there was malicious code within the LNK file, which made the stick automatically infect the connected computer, even when the auto run feature was turned off.
Yeah, so there you go.
So, and that one was, I believe that one was part of the Stuxnet. It was also used with Stuxnet, that vulnerability.
Right, and if you remember our discussion about Stuxnet a while back, we talked about the theory that somebody had left behind USB sticks out in the parking lot, right? The old social engineering attack. Somebody wants to be helpful, try to figure out who owns it. They plug it into a computer, and boom, it's infected. And that way, if there was an engineer taking his laptop in to do some analysis on that air-gapped network, that would be one way it could have spread that malware. So this just uses the same technique to do that. Also, linking back to if this is an NSA group doing it, and they, in theory, could have probably wrote Stuxnet as well, then hey, these groups probably are interrelated in some way, or at least share code. So we talked about the main malware platforms. What's interesting is that these have changed quite a bit over time. There's compiled versions starting from 2003 on some cases all the way up to 2013 that have been detected. And these obviously they're being revised and improved over time. There's some discussion about version numbers for each of these platforms, stuff that they've been able to detect from decompiling the code and disassembling a lot of the code that's there. And there's a lot of internal version numbers there, so you can see how a lot of these platforms have advanced over time. What I think was interesting is some of the detail talking specifically about the Grayfish architecture and the boot steps and how they had diagrammed how that all works. There's even some discussion about how the Fanny malware works internally as well. And so there's a lot of detail in the report, and I'd encourage anybody to take a look at it and really see the level of sophistication here. What's interesting also is the various means that the malware was deployed, and some of that we talked about with Fanny. That was deployed using the USB sticks. Physical media. There's an interesting story in the blog post from Kaspersky about somebody who had attended a conference and then later received a CD-ROM in the mail, and that CD, which looked to be from the original conference organizers, was actually a malware platform on a CD and delivered to the attendees. They also use some web-based exploits, and that can be used to infect websites that where a lot of like-minded individuals would like to go to gather, perhaps to share their thoughts online, and so having that malicious code was one way in which they could load a lot of this malware onto the victims' computers, mostly because of their shared ideology or whatever, and this was a forum that they used to do that. So I thought that was interesting. So it's not just one method. It's not all phishing emails as their primary choice. In fact, that wasn't really mentioned at all. one way that's very successful for most is phishing emails right now, but they didn't take that technique. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems to me like this group was meant to hit the difficult to hit targets, not the low. This is not the low hanging fruit targets. This is the high hanging fruit targets.
Absolutely.
That we're talking about here. I mean, we're talking about air gap networks. That's not an easy task to write a piece of malware to get data on a computer that's not connected to the internet.
Absolutely.
And when you look and see where they said Fanny was implemented at a lot of it, a huge percentage, I think almost 60% was in Pakistan, which makes you, like, for me, I thought about the old news where I was hearing that these informants were going to cafes to submit emails and submit communications on behalf of these kingpins, or such as, I can't think of his name off my head, but like the kingpin higher level guys that were in these compounds that didn't have internet at the compounds, so they would have a messenger take their data to a coffee shop. I'm assuming these were some of the targets that this was used on, if you're looking at a high percentage being in Pakistan.
That would make sense.
Yeah, that would make sense why they would want to do this, essentially. I mean, the other, obviously, with Stuxnet, they were dealing with some industrial equipment that wouldn't have been connected to the internet as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons to want to look at air gap networks, especially if you're an espionage agency. So, I mean, it makes sense. And I also found interesting the whole replacing the bootloader and essentially becoming the bootloader for Windows and dealing with each step of the loading process and essentially loading up a version of Windows that's just an infected version of Windows. And I thought that was interesting as well. I mean, it's very sophisticated, and you've got to. I mean, you've got to think that this must be a government entity, because the amount of money and time and effort that it would take to do this is not obtainable by normal means. I wouldn't think. I mean, just the hard drive firmware thing is I mean, either they had help from industry, or they had a lot of time, because from what I've read, dealing with hard drive firmware, that basically you're allowed to write to hard drive firmware, but you're not allowed to read it. So reverse engineering hard drive firmware is really hard.
It helps if you have the original code, right?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, it helps if you have the original code.
Right. So what would it take to get that, right? So
well, that's really the question. Either they had help, like it was provided to them, or they essentially stole it. I mean,
and I've heard a couple speculations on that. One being that a certain government agency or government in general might say, well, we're willing to buy your hard drives. However, we need to know, because you manufacture those in China, that the Chinese haven't put any secret backdoors into the drive firmware. So why don't you share that with us so we can review it? Possibly.
Yeah, that's a possibility, certainly.
The other is that I think we know, that the NSA has spent a lot of effort on trying to subvert a variety of IT products. The one example that we recalled was the Cisco example, where they took equipment out of the box, installed backdoors basically in the firmware there, and then sealed it up with what looked like Cisco tape and shipped it on to its final destination. Well, if they're doing that, why can't they do it at the hard drive factory, right? Or wherever they're developing their hard drive firmware. There could be some amount of clandestine operations trying to get access to that code, with the company's knowledge, maybe without. Who knows? So
yeah. we can just guess. That's
all guesswork.
That's ultimately all we can do is guess, and I mean that's all anybody can really do, except the people who are directly involved, and we're not going to hear anything from them. So just the whole thing's interesting, and mistakes were made, and that's how we got this report, is by mistakes being made. So I mean, even a highly sophisticated group makes mistakes, and I'm guessing having been unreported and undetected for 14 years, they pretty much anybody becomes a little more confident over time and makes more and more mistakes, and that may be what happened here. So
let's talk a little bit about their CNC infrastructure. What we do know is there are roughly 300 domains and 100 servers that are part of the CNC infrastructure, and Kaspersky has been able to sinkhole a handful of those. So there may be 12. I don't remember. It's about a dozen or so that they've actually sinkholed. And in sinkholing them, they're looking at the traffic coming into those CNC servers. And what I found interesting is, while they don't have any specific samples, they believe that some of the malware that's out in the wild that they haven't gotten their hands on yet may affect Mac OS X and iPhones. Mostly because they're looking at the header strings of requests coming into those sinkholed sites. So the speculation is that there might be more malware that hasn't been detected yet. There's no samples available that any lab has looked at that they know of that would affect other platforms besides Windows. And that right there is also very, very, very scary, exciting, interesting stuff.
Yes, scary stuff, certainly. Now, we say it's scary, but I really don't think the three of us have to worry about any of this. I mean, as far as getting infected. So I'm guessing we would not be considered interesting by their definition of interesting.
I don't think so. And we know that roughly by the victims that have been interesting enough, right? And we know that those victims are in a variety of countries, but not the U.S. specifically. Now, some of them may be targets in the sense that because of their ideology and their visiting to certain websites, they may have been infected. That might make them interesting. But those, for the most part, do not seem to be Western countries, if you will.
Yes, they seem to not be. They seem to be kind of, I guess, targets you'd kind of expect the U.S. to hit.
That's one way to look at it, yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't think we have to worry, but it's interesting to talk about. So there's a lot of information, and we've talked about a lot of different pieces of malware and stuff like that, but there's a high likelihood that this isn't everything that's out there that this group has come up with. So this is, from my understanding, what Kaspersky did was they found something and they went back and looked at previous things and discovered more stuff within their logs that they hadn't caught before, and this led to this essentially report. Plus, apparently, they let a few command and control servers, their domain names lapse, and they were able to register some of those domains, and essentially they could figure out what this malware was doing. Now, these command and control servers were for the very old malware. Which malware was it?
Double Fantasy.
Yeah, Double Fantasy, I think. And so it's old malware that they may have not been interested in continuing to monitor, but it gave Kaspersky a chance to essentially take these domains and watch the traffic.
Yep, and it's interesting because assume that a lot of these sites or a lot of systems out there have been infected. They're still infected. There's obviously now these antivirus companies have something to look for, and so they could start removing it. But this is still old stuff that they found. 2013 was the last date of development on most of it. And what year are we in? 2015. That's right.
Yeah.
And that's a long time. And I'm sure they were very busy in 2014. They're probably very busy in 2015. And probably so busy that nobody's caught it yet.
Yes, and even looking at the stuff that they've done, for example, hardware, firmware rewriting, creating a bootloader that, loads Windows and using registry, a virtual file system within the registry. I think those, out of those three, cannot really be detected with an antivirus on a PC, at least not any antivirus I'm familiar with. So these have taken great effort to avoid being detected.
Absolutely.
So great effort, and being persistent and staying around, even with like an OS reinstall or even a hard drive wipe. So there's been a lot of effort to be persistent and stay there.
Yeah, and what I find really interesting, we talked about FANY being the tool to map out air-gapped networks. Where's the one place you don't use a lot of security? That's in your air-gapped networks, right?
Yeah.
Why would you need
you're not
You're not connected to a network.
I mean, you're not connected to an internet. I don't need a firewall.
I don't need antivirus. Why would you get malware on this, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
In fact, I mean, antivirus would be hard to run on an air-gapped network.
It would be. Where would
Because
you get
you'd have
updates?
to update it.
Exactly.
Right.
So why run it, right?
Yeah.
Oops.
Yeah, and even if you do run it, you're probably going to have to be putting USB sticks in your
Probably will.
in the computer to
transferring
update
it from
it,
your
so.
internet computer to your non-internet computer, and yeah.
So
This is smart stuff. It is. So yeah.
So anyway, I think
to get around FANY for air-gapped networks, would your best bet be to just be bringing burnt disk then back and forth?
Yeah, you'd be better off, I think. But you still have to trust the data you're putting on that CD.
When you're leaving that? Oh, yeah. To bring it on.
You never know if it's got some infected file in there that you don't have a defense for because you're not running antivirus on your air-gapped network.
right, and we don't know that. I mean, maybe FANY, one of the things they do is they insert code on CDs that get burned.
Could
I
be.
mean, it's possible. It doesn't say it does, but I mean, they can only reverse engineer it so much. So
Yeah.
who knows?
You gotta have the samples too, and if you don't have samples to look at to figure out how it works,
Right.
there's that problem. So
Yeah.
it sounds like there could be malicious code out there for Macs and iPhones and who knows what else. Which, given the level of sophistication we've seen just on the Windows side here, from what we talked about, I have no doubt that they probably have a lot of exploits and a lot of exploitable code and malware platforms that run on a lot of other platforms. So.
Yeah, we didn't.
There
I
you go.
don't think we didn't even talk about everything that was in the report, and even after that, I'm sure this report just isn't everything. There's more out there, more, maybe even with more sophistication than anything that's on this list, it's never been detected.
Right.
So.
And it probably will be harder and harder in the future to detect it, because I think the goal of this type of stuff is to avoid detection.
Right.
And what little they've found and been able to look at is probably been pretty lucky. They've been pretty lucky to get that.
Yes. I agree. All right, well, I think we should wrap it up. I think we're at our time. So, any last words, I guess? Any last comments?
Yeah, stay scared.
Yes. There's a lot of scary stuff out there, but I don't think any of us have to worry about this type of stuff. But
Well, let's just put it this way: if big if the United States government has been able to develop this level of sophistication, what can another well-funded
Well,
government
that's true.
secret agency do
well, that is
to
true.
us?
That is true.
So
That is
if
very
you look
true.
at it as a form of one-upsmanship, I'm sure there's another well-funded government group out there somewhere going, "Oh yeah, we did that 3 years ago, and we got something even better that's almost done. You just wait."
Yeah, that's true. So anyway, so be scared. I guess that is a
scared, all
good
right.
thing to say. Be scared. All right. Well, thanks to Josh Gillum and Keith Watson. I'm Preston Wiley, and keep your eyes on privacy.